So, Holy Week, day two of the week. I guess depending on who you talk to, day two could be Sunday or Monday. I mean Monday or Tuesday, but day two being Monday. Whereas on Sunday, when Jesus rode into Jerusalem, lampooning the imperial state, and ended the day by giving the temple a quick gander. Monday, his attention turned to the religious governance of Israel, of Jerusalem. On Sunday, he contrasted the overstated grandeur of the Roman prefect by strolling into town on a donkey. Who rides a donkey? On this day, on this Monday, he used a fig tree as the foil to the temple, and he created ruckus in the temple. Now, Mark reads, the next day, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Okay, now mind you, this is an analogy, but this is an actual occurrence as well. I guess it's an allegory. Jesus was hungry. In other words, he wanted for something. He wanted for something. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. So Jesus wanted for something. He saw a fig tree. He went to see if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found it had nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples heard him say it. Standing on its own, I mean, you can draw a lot of conclusions, you make a lot of inferences, and in past, in reflection, we can see a lot of parallels between this fig tree and what he saw as the kingdom of the Jews at the time, supposedly bearing fruit but not. But let's just keep moving. Some scholars believe that this cursing of the fig tree represented God's judgment on the spiritually dead leaders of Israel. Others believe the symbolism extended to all believers at the time, demonstrating that genuine faith is more than just outward religiosity. True living faith must bear fruit. Bear fruit, it must. I mean, there's no two ways about it. If you're living in the way that you're supposed to, your life should be bearing fruit. Now, this may have seemed a bit harsh to condemn a fig tree, but this action with the fig tree would come to frame his interaction in his sentiments towards the temple. Here we had a fig tree whose purpose was to produce figs, to provide sustenance, and Jesus wanted sustenance. It had leaves, but it had no figs. It may have looked good, it may have been strong, it may have had the proper DNA, the proper education, the proper makeup, the proper leadership, the proper looks, the proper hair, the riches, and so forth. But it did not serve its primary purpose, to bear fruit. Generally, if a mature fruit tree has leaves, it should have fruit. The last line here, though, is, and his disciples heard him say it. A lot of times we read lines and we just kind of blur right through them and we're just thinking, okay, his disciples heard it. But his disciples heard him say it. It's important because it was meant to be a lesson for them. For them, it was meant for them to be a lesson. And frankly, if they hadn't heard it, how would someone have written about it later? I know when I read this, I was taken aback because I'm thinking that Jesus expected this tree to have fruit on its vines, despite it not even being in season. But I guess the point here is that always be prepared. No matter what the season, always be productive, always be bearing fruit. We don't know when the time is going to come. We don't know when doomsday clock is going to strike midnight. We don't know when the thief will come in the middle of the night. But whether the temperature is warm or hot, we should always be producing. We should always be producing. Another take on this coincides with the parable of the talents, which Jesus told in Matthew 25, where a master had given 3 of his servants gold. He gave one 5 pieces, he gave one 2 pieces, and he gave one 1 piece. The one out of fear of losing it buried it and did not produce any more. The one with 5 and the one with 2 put the gold to work and doubled their fortunes. The master returned, and the first 2 servants, the one that gave 5, the one he gave 2, returned double the gold to the master and left them, and they were rewarded with a share of this happiness. However, he severely punished the one who buried it. He cast him out into the darkness where there was weeping and gnashing of teeth. Jesus does not play. If you do not use what he is giving you to produce, he will cast you into the darkness. Ergo the fig tree, which he cast to die. It wasn't producing. There was no life, no production. He subjected it to, he sentenced it to death. This was a forecast of the destiny of the temple, which he was on his way to. Verse 15 reads, on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, it is not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. What is a den of robbers? It's a place where robbers return to hide. The temple was created to be a place of what? A place of worship, not a den of robbers. It was called a house of prayer to all nations. So just as the fig tree was to produce fruit, so was it. So was this house of prayer. But it had become a den of robbers. Now, there was nothing innately wrong with being a money changer. A money changer was a lot like being the Thomas Exchange, where you go to change euros to pesos for dollars, or so that you can conduct commerce in the locale, in the country that you're in. Money changers were necessary for commerce as people visited the temple from foreign lands. There was nothing innately wrong with selling doves or other merchandise. Doves were sold because they were all that the poor could afford to sacrifice. They were used by the poor to sacrifice because again they couldn't afford lambs or big game or larger animals. And according to Mark 11:16, Jesus then put an embargo on people carrying any merchandise into the temple, a sanction that would have disrupted all of this commerce. So you can imagine in the courthouse there was all sorts of money changing. They were selling doves and other animals and other things. And who was selling these things? It wasn't like a swap meet. It wasn't a bazaar where just anyone could roll up in there. This was the temple managers, the Sanhedrin. That's how they were making money. He disrupted their commerce. So again, there was nothing innately wrong with being a money changer, being a dove seller, or some of these things. But what was behind it? What was going on behind it? Just like there was nothing innately wrong with a fig tree having leaves. As a matter of fact, a fig tree should have leaves. And I'm no scientist. I think that leaves are necessary for a tree to survive, just as it was necessary for the temple to have money. But the house of prayer was devoid of prayer. It didn't maintain its primary purpose. Just like the fig tree, it was without fruit, literally and figuratively. So imagine this. A man walks into the busy center of Jerusalem. The temple, to his chagrin, which was supposed to be the center of worship, had become the center of business during Passover. It was not a quiet, empty setting. Here, a man stopped people from buying and selling. He turned over the merchant tables and stopped all trade. Do you understand what was happening here? Imagine if a pretty well-built guy went into Harris Teeter or Pathmark, ShopRite, Ralph's, Safeway, wherever your local supermarket is, and went up to each register to stop buying of all goods, and went and turned over the bread, threw around some cold cuts, smashed some fruit, pulled down the store signage, just went crazy up in there. I don't know if he would get past throwing the first tomato before security would have yoked him up. But in this setting, Jesus had stopped commerce of not just the local supermarket, but the commercial center of the Jewish world. So it'd be like walking down Wall Street, walking into the stock exchange, and making it stop. Now, we weren't given any physical description of the power demonstrated by Jesus to do this, because this isn't the point, not like Samson taking out the evil Philistines with his strength. But Jesus's feat here is impressive. I mean, again, this isn't just, me walking into the corner of the bodega, saying, stop buying that can of tuna fish. He was in the middle of the commercial center of Jerusalem during Passover and stopped business. Impressive. Again, think Times Square. Putting it on pause. I mean, unfortunately, think about what it looks like today in the midst of the coronavirus. I'm sure you've seen the pictures of cities just being put on pause and how crazy that looks. He was at the stock market and he put it on pause. He put it on stop. He froze it. Quick context. The temple and its leadership do not resemble that of Solomon's era the millennium prior. The high priest was a local lord who was charged with keeping the Jews in line. Okay? The temple in that day was built, the temple in that day, when Jesus was there, was built during the Babylonian rule. It was ruled by several empires over the ages to come. It had independence at some point for 100 years during the Maccabee era, which was, a couple hundred years before Christ. However, the Romans took over, so they set the current system up in about 63 BC, about, give or take, 100 years or so before Jesus had entered the system there. So this system had been around for 100 years, right? Just short of 100 years again before Jesus entered the city. So Roman rule was governed by a high priest. So Rome ruled through a high priest who was selected by the Roman prefect, who at this time we talked about in yesterday was Pontius Pilate. He was like a modern governor. And they were generally selected from one of 4 aristocratic families. They were given a free hand to rule just so, of course, they agreed to prom, and they were loyal to the order of Rome. They paid taxes and tribute to the Roman government. Basically, pay to play. Some free hand, right? The high priest could be hired or fired at Rome's whim. Herod the Great, or Herod the Malicious, as some was known, was the first of the Roman appointed high priests, right? He, like a mob boss, killed those who he deemed to be a threat to his position and power. He took over lands by eminent domain, declaring lands the property of the state so that he could build residences, temples, aqueducts, government buildings, and other structures, right? He oversaw and allowed the takeover of peasant farms by the wealthy, where people used to grow their own, by which they fed their family and sold goods to make a living, right? So, I owned a farm, I owned a house, I grew tomatoes and cucumbers and watermelon, and then I go to the market to sell so I can buy fish and eggs, meat and bread and milk and other stuff to provide for my family. But during Herod's rule, he allowed the rich to go in and he allowed them to come take my farm. So now I didn't have land, and I would have to rent land. And in renting this land, I was overpriced, so I never really could buy it back. And anything I made was the property or was owned by the person who owned the property. So I had to buy it from them. So I was always in debt. I was paying for the property, and I was paying for the use of the land to grow stuff. It was a sharecropping system, which spread. It was sharecropping. I mean, a system of dominant system created to consolidate the wealth of the land to the very few. If you're familiar with sharecropping, it was a very hard system for many to break. I pause there because I want you to think about the similarities of this system to where we are today. Now, I'm not going to go down that road today, but we do need to be conscious of, or as they say, we need to be woke to, what some economic systems do to those who have and those who don't. Let's keep it moving. The temple became the center of a domination system, which we spoke about. It became the center of a local collaboration with Rome. It was the engine that allowed for economic exploitation of the people of Jerusalem and became the money changing and the commerce. It's where money changing and commerce in the temple occurred, right? These acts were shrouded in religious mystery or religious legitimacy. So due to high taxes collected at the temple and the inequitable distribution of wealth that was generated in Rome, peasant life got worse during this era. Rome got rich. The regular folks, the middle class and poor got worse off. Tithes were collected at the temple. Imperial taxes were collected at the temple. Records of debt were collected at the temple. The high priest had to coordinate and collect the tribute to Rome and keep the locales unrest at bay. The locals at unrest at bay. Though they were supposed to be like current judges, serve for life in accordance with Jewish law, the Roman prefect he didn't acknowledge that. He changed them at his will. So you got to imagine these high priests spent much of their time trying to protect their status with Rome and not caring for their people. They were suck-ups. And I'm painting this picture because I want you to understand what was going on here. Prior to entering Jerusalem, though, this week, Jesus was critical. He had already been critical of this system, right? He was critical of the tributary domination system and the temple's role in it. So much so that, according to the Gospels, there was a bounty out for Christ even before he came to Jerusalem. And even before he gets in the discourse that's going to come over the next couple of days. During this time, the high priest claimed the temple to be a source of forgiveness. It mandated sacrifice, which was the means for forgiveness, and sacrifice which was given in the temple alone, what could only be given in the temple. So you had to pay to play. In order to give sacrifice, you could only do it in the temple. In order to give sacrifice, you had to have something to sacrifice. And the poor couldn't afford anything, so they had to buy the doves, which were overpriced, in the temple. And it was the only means that they preached to forgiveness. So basically, they had to buy their forgiveness through the high priest. In other words, they had to pay to play. Jesus told them that the priests were corrupting the temple and that they were not necessary for forgiveness in any way. So in essence, Jesus came and destroyed the system. What he was preaching was the antithesis. They were saying, hey, you got to pay to come take a sacrifice. And the only place you can pay and make a sacrifice is in the temple. And Jesus came and said, no, you don't. So you can imagine they were hot because he basically undermined their authority. I want to read something here. Jeremiah 7. Verse 4 starts with, do not trust in deceptive words, chanting, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. For if you really change your ways and deeds, if you act justly toward one another, if you no longer oppress the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, and no longer shed innocent blood in this place or follow other gods to your own harm, then I will allow you to live in this place, in the land I give to your fathers forever and ever. God promised to protect those people if they took care of the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. In other words, take care of all people. But look, you keep trusting in deceptive words to no avail. Will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal, and follow other gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in my house, which bears my name, and say, we are delivered so we can continue with all those abominations? Has this house which bears my name become a den of robbers in your sight? Yes, I too have seen it, declares the Lord. That was Jeremiah 7, 4 through 11. This is part of the incredible character of the Bible, which was old is new. That which was old is new. This is the Old Testament scripture that spoke of Jesus Christ. It fits perfectly over this scene. And mind you, what was written in Jeremiah happened hundreds of years prior to Jesus Christ coming, but it fits perfectly over the scene of Jesus in the temple. Jesus is the embodiment of the Old Testament. The temple, which is supposed to be, as Jesus himself stated, a house of prayer for all nations, had become a swap meet. Though there is nothing wrong with the swap meet, it did not belong there as a safe haven for the crooked. And after Jesus took out his mode and mood on the temple, we had some challenges, we had some issues, we had some confrontation. Now Mark records, the chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this about Jesus going in and turning over tables and so forth, and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed at what he had been teaching. At this time, Jesus still had the adoration of the people, which is what kept the priests from having him arrested on the spot. Just think, a guy had just rode into town the previous day on a donkey and was celebrated. He then comes to the temple and creates havoc. There must have been some reason for the high priest. For some reason, the high priest did not have him absconded immediately. They feared him. He had just stopped business single-handedly. They also feared what the crowds would do to him if they had arrested him. They feared his message. His message was the kingdom of God, and that the kingdom, all were taken care of in the kingdom. not just the religious aristocracy, not just the well-to-do, those who were in power. Everyone counts. It was the operation of commerce in the temple that padded the pockets of the high priests. His interruptions of the marketplace was messing with their money and their influence. He had their hearts and their minds in a constituency, and they wanted him gone. When the evening came, Mark continues, when the evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. Jesus left. On Sunday, he made a humble entry into great reception by the people as he lampooned the state. On Monday, he cursed the fig tree, then confronted the religious community and its crooked commerce. This set the stage for the conflicts with the religious leaders on Tuesday, the next day. It starts to get real exciting on Tuesday. Everything that's happened up to this point is setting the stage. Jesus and his disciples left the city that night, but returned in the morning. The point here is a fig tree that is not yielding fruit is useless. A temple that is not a house of prayer is useless. What is a house of prayer? Then it was a building. Today is us. It's people. It's our bodies. It's us. A temple that is not a house of prayer is useless. Personalize that. A temple that is not a house of prayer is useless. The fate of the useless temple is that of the useless fig tree. The fruitless fig tree was put to death. So was the temple. Jesus came to usher in a new way. Jesus came to usher in a new way.